I want to tell you something real, something lived, not theory, not poetry, not wishful thinking. This psalm didn't just soothe my mind. It didn't just make me feel spiritual. This psalm paid my bills. And when I say that, I'm not speaking in metaphor. I mean, it moved money. It rearranged circumstances. It shifted outcomes that logic said were impossible. There was a time when the numbers didn't add up. The due dates were loud, the silence after sending applications, proposals, prayers. It was louder. I did everything the world teaches you to do. Budgeted, hustled, worried, calculated. And still, lack stared back at me like a locked door. That's when I learned something life-changing. Effort without alignment exhausts you, but alignment without strain opens doors you never touched. One night, not dramatic, not mystical, just tired, I opened a psalm, not to beg, not to plead, just to rest my mind in truth. And I read it slowly, as if every word were already true. I didn't rush. I didn't analyze. I let the words sink past fear, past memory, past failures. I wasn't trying to convince God. I was allowing myself to be convinced, and something subtle happened. My breathing changed. The tightness in my chest loosened. I wasn't imagining bills anymore. I was imagining provision as a law, not a hope. That psalm reminded me that supply is not earned by anxiety. It flows by recognition. Here is what no one tells you. Money responds to consciousness, not to desperation, not to force, consciousness. When you read truth as fact instead of fantasy, the outer world reorganizes to match the inner knowing. I didn't say the psalm once and wait. I lived in it. I spoke it when fear tried to interrupt. I returned to it when doubt knocked. Not with emotion, emotion comes and goes, but with quiet certainty. And then things began to happen in ways I couldn't have planned. A delay turned into a discount. A closed door revealed a better one already open. Money came from places I had mentally ruled out. Old connections resurfaced. Opportunities appeared that weren't even on my radar. And the most important shift, I wasn't shocked when it happened. Because somewhere inside, I already knew. That's the power of the word when it's no longer just words. When a psalm stops being scripture on a page and becomes an agreement in your mind. When you don't ask, will this work? But instead say, this is how it works. I learned that lack is not a condition, it's a suggestion. And suggestions only have power when you accept them. The psalm didn't change God's willingness to give. It changed my willingness to receive. It corrected the false belief that I had to struggle to deserve ease. It reminded me that supply is already established. My role was alignment, not effort. Listen carefully. Repeating truth while still emotionally arguing with it will tire you. But resting in truth as final will move mountains quietly. I stopped watching the clock. I stopped counting days. I stopped rehearsing worst-case scenarios. Instead, I rehearsed the promise, not as future tense, but as present fact. And no, everything didn't happen overnight, but everything changed immediately inside me. And that inner shift was the signal the universe responded to, because the world always echoes your dominant assumption. When the bill came, I didn't panic. I acknowledged it, and then acknowledged a higher law. When fear tried to speak louder than faith, I didn't fight it. I replaced it, gently, firmly, repeatedly, until peace became my default. And here's the part people miss. Peace is not passive. Peace is authority without noise. When you're at peace, you're no longer begging life. You're directing it. That psalm taught me that provision doesn't chase effort. It follows belief. That money is not separate from spirituality. It is one of its expressions. That divine order includes rent, groceries, opportunities, and unexpected checks. Nothing is too small or too worldly for the law of abundance. So if you're listening to me right now and you're tired of trying, tired of hoping, tired of almost, hear this. You don't need a new strategy. You need a new agreement. An agreement with truth. An agreement with supply. An agreement that what is promised is not symbolic. It is practical. Read the psalm again, but this time don't read it as comfort. Read it as confirmation. Speak it not to feel better, but because it is law. Let it settle. Let it work while you rest. Let it handle what your worry never could. Because when truth becomes your atmosphere, lack has no place to stay. And one day, quietly, almost casually, you'll realize the bills are paid, not by force, not by fear, but by alignment, and you'll smile. Not because you were lucky, but because you finally understood how it works. I wasn't praying in panic anymore. That was the first real shift. Before, every word came from urgency, from that quiet fear that maybe I was asking too late or asking wrong. I would read sacred words while secretly negotiating with doubt, hoping something would change outside while nothing had truly settled inside. But there came a moment when I realized begging was exhausting me, and it wasn't producing alignment. It was reinforcing lack. The moment I stopped pleading and started agreeing, everything softened. Agreement doesn't mean forcing belief. It means allowing truth to feel final. I wasn't trying to move heaven anymore. I was letting heaven move me. When I opened the psalm again, it felt different. I wasn't scanning it for reassurance or emotional comfort. I read it as a statement of law, not a suggestion. I let each sentence land without argument. I noticed how often the mind tries to interrupt truth with memory, past failures, unpaid bills, delays. This time, I didn't wrestle with those thoughts. I simply returned to the words and accepted them as already active. Agreement doesn't shout, it settles. And in that settling, fear begins to lose its authority. There's a subtle arrogance in begging that we don't often talk about, the assumption that supply must be persuaded to show up. But when you agree with truth, you acknowledge that provision is already established. You stop asking, "Will this work for me?" and start saying, "This is how it works." That inner shift removes resistance. I wasn't trying to change circumstances anymore. I was changing the agreement that had created them. The psalm stopped being something I recited and became something I lived inside of. I began to notice how often my language had been working against me. Even while praying, I was rehearsing lack, speaking about bills, delays, and pressure as if they were permanent realities. Agreement with truth required discipline, not force. I didn't deny what was due, but I refused to give it final authority. I acknowledged facts, but I stood on law. The psalm became my reference point, my internal compass. Whenever anxiety tried to speak louder, I gently returned to agreement. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just firmly. Something powerful happens when you stop asking and start allowing. Allowing removes strain. It tells the subconscious that safety is present, that supply is not in question. And the subconscious listens. It begins to reorganize perception. Opportunities that were invisible before suddenly feel obvious. Ideas arise without pressure. Conversations shift. You don't feel hunted by time anymore. You feel supported by order. Agreement also changes how you wait. Waiting no longer feels like delay. It feels like preparation. I wasn't counting days or watching for signs. I was resting in expectation without urgency. That kind of expectation is magnetic. It doesn't chase, it attracts. And the outer world always responds to the inner posture you maintain the longest. I realized that begging keeps you focused on what you don't have, while agreement keeps you conscious of what is already promised. One reinforces absence, the other activates presence. The psalm reminded me that I was never meant to convince life to be good to me. Life responds naturally when the mind is aligned with truth. Once I understood that, the pressure lifted. I wasn't responsible for the how anymore. My responsibility was agreement, and slowly, quietly, things began to adjust, not all at once, not with fireworks, but with precision. Situations resolved themselves without strain. Support came through channels I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't shocked by it, because agreement had already prepared me to receive. When you agree internally, the external confirmation feels natural, not miraculous. That's when I understood the real power of the psalm. It didn't work because I repeated it endlessly. It worked because I stopped contradicting it. I let it be true without needing proof first. I trusted order before seeing evidence, and once that trust settled in, the need to beg disappeared completely. Agreement is quiet confidence. It doesn't rush, explain, or defend itself. It simply knows. And when you know, life follows. For a long time, I believed that money was something you had to chase, corner, and somehow earn through constant tension. I thought if I wasn't exhausted, I wasn't doing enough. Struggle felt noble. Rest felt irresponsible. And without realizing it, I had trained my mind to associate effort with worthiness and ease with risk. So even when opportunities appeared, I met them with anxiety instead of openness. I was working hard, but my inner state was working against me. That's when I began to see a truth that changed everything. Money doesn't respond to motion, it responds to consciousness. Consciousness is the atmosphere you carry inside you every day. It's the expectation you wake up with, the assumption you return to when nothing seems to be happening. I noticed that even while working, I was expecting difficulty. Even while praying, I was anticipating delay. That expectation was shaping my results more than my actions ever did. When I shifted my inner posture from "I must struggle to survive" to "supply is normal and available," the pressure dissolved. I didn't stop taking action, but action stopped being heavy. It became guided instead of forced. Struggle has a strange way of narrowing your vision. When you're tense, you only see what you're afraid of losing. Your mind stays busy calculating, controlling, protecting. But consciousness rooted in ease widens perception. Suddenly, you notice options, you hear ideas, you feel prompted to reach out, to wait, or to move, without panic attached. Money flows through awareness, not desperation. The more I relaxed into trust, the clearer my thinking became. And clarity is far more productive than stress. I also realized that fear sends mixed signals. On the surface, you say you want abundance, but underneath, you're bracing for disappointment. That inner contradiction blocks flow. When consciousness is aligned, when desire and expectation agree, movement becomes effortless. I stopped affirming abundance while emotionally preparing for lack. Instead, I practiced neutrality. I allowed peace to replace urgency. And that neutrality gave space for solutions to surface naturally. Opportunities began to show up in ways that didn't feel dramatic, but felt right. Conversations led to openings. Timing improved without me forcing it. Money arrived through paths I hadn't planned because my consciousness was no longer limited to one outcome. I wasn't gripping a single solution anymore. I trusted the principle of supply rather than a specific method, and that trust expanded the channels through which provision could come. Struggle also teaches the subconscious that money is difficult to receive. Ease teaches it that money is safe. Once my inner world felt safe with supply, the outer world reflected that safety. Bills no longer triggered panic. They became temporary details, not threats. That shift alone changed my relationship with money. I was no longer reacting, I was responding. And response always carries authority, while reaction carries fear. I learned that consciousness sets the tone, and circumstances follow the tone. When my dominant state was worry, I attracted reasons to worry. When my dominant state became calm expectation, things aligned without friction. This wasn't passivity, it was precision. I was finally cooperating with the law instead of fighting it. The greatest relief came when I stopped measuring progress by struggle. I no longer needed to prove my effort. I trusted alignment to do what anxiety never could. And the moment I did, money stopped feeling like a battle and started behaving like a response. For the longest time, I thought peace meant doing nothing, staying quiet, or accepting whatever showed up without resistance. I confused calm with weakness, but experience taught me something very different. Peace is not passive, it is grounded authority. Panic reacts, peace decides. And when I learned to stand in peace, everything around me began to respond differently. Before that shift, every bill felt like an emergency. Every delay felt personal. My nervous system was constantly on alert, scanning for what might go wrong next. Even when things were temporarily fine, I was already bracing for collapse. That inner chaos kept me stuck in reaction mode. I was responding to life from fear instead of directing it from certainty. Peace didn't arrive when the problems disappeared. It arrived when I stopped letting problems dictate my inner state. The moment a bill arrived, I practiced something new. I acknowledged it fully, no denial, no avoidance, but I refused to panic. I noticed how panic demanded immediate emotional energy, while peace asked for stillness. In that stillness, I reminded myself that circumstances are not creators, they are results. The bill wasn't proof of lack, it was a snapshot of a moment in time. And moments can change quickly when the mind stops fueling fear. Peace changed the way I spoke, even internally. I stopped narrating worst-case scenarios. I stopped repeating what-if questions that led nowhere. Instead, I held a quiet inner knowing that order was working on my behalf. This wasn't blind optimism. It was trust rooted in understanding. I had seen enough to know that anxiety never produced solutions, but clarity often arrived when I was calm. When you are peaceful, you stop leaking energy. Fear scatters attention. Peace gathers it. That gathered attention becomes power. I could think clearly. I could listen. I could act without urgency. And because my actions were no longer rushed, they were precise. One aligned decision accomplished more than weeks of frantic effort ever did. Peace also changed how others responded to me. Conversations felt smoother. Requests were received more openly. I wasn't transmitting desperation anymore. I was transmitting confidence. People sense that. Opportunities sense that too. Life mirrors the state you are most familiar with, and once peace became familiar, outcomes followed. What surprised me most was how quickly things shifted once fear lost its grip. Not because I forced change, but because I stopped resisting flow. Fear is noisy, peace is firm. Fear begs, peace expects. That expectation doesn't come with tension. It comes with assurance. And assurance is magnetic. I learned that when you remain calm in the face of pressure, you are not ignoring reality. You are choosing which law governs the moment. Panic obeys circumstances. Peace invokes order. And once I understood that, I stopped seeing calm as something I earned after success. Calm became the cause, not the reward. That is when I realized peace wasn't just an emotional state, it was a position. And from that position, life began to rearrange itself without struggle. For a long time, I believed that change would come when life decided to be kinder to me, when circumstances finally softened, or when something external shifted in my favor. I didn't realize that everything was already waiting on one thing, my agreement. The promise had always existed. The supply was never missing. What was missing was my willingness to stop resisting what was already mine. I thought I needed new affirmations, stronger words, more repetition. In reality, I needed to stop arguing with truth internally. I had been saying the right words while holding the wrong assumptions. Outwardly, I spoke about faith and provision, but inwardly, I questioned whether it could really apply to me, whether I had waited too long, failed too much, or asked too often. That inner hesitation acted like a closed door. The moment I recognized that, something shifted. I stopped asking if the promise would work and allowed myself to live as if it already was. Agreement isn't pretending. It's permitting truth to become personal. When I fully agreed, I noticed how resistance had been draining my energy. Resistance shows up as overthinking, second-guessing, and constantly checking for evidence. Agreement, on the other hand, feels settled. It doesn't need proof to relax. It trusts order to unfold. And once I entered that state, I stopped trying to manage outcomes. I wasn't controlling timing anymore. I wasn't monitoring progress. I was available to receive. That availability changed everything. Opportunities no longer felt surprising. They felt appropriate. Support didn't feel accidental. It felt aligned. I realized that abundance doesn't force its way into a resistant mind. It flows naturally into a receptive one. My agreement created space, and space invites movement. I also learned that agreement requires consistency, not intensity. It's not about feeling powerful every moment. It's about returning to trust when doubt tries to interrupt. I didn't punish myself for fear. I simply didn't let it lead. Whenever uncertainty surfaced, I gently returned to the same inner stance. This is already handled. That repetition trained my mind to expect resolution instead of struggle. Once agreement became my default, lack had nowhere to settle. It couldn't anchor itself in a mind that no longer entertained it as permanent. Situations that once lingered began to resolve. Delays shortened. Solutions appeared without force. And the more I trusted, the more natural receiving felt. What changed my life wasn't the discovery of a new truth. It was the decision to stop resisting an old one. Agreement turned promise into experience. And when alignment replaced effort, provision followed quietly, without struggle, without strain, right on time.